leeches descend into battle, disregarding the Rangers. Sensing their opportunity, Langford, Kinsey, and Batten launched renewed attacks on the nest, which it warded off with one of its tendrils, using the thick mana that filled the cavern to try to crush them. Phoenix was unconscious, blood beginning to drip from her nostrils and ears as the tremendous pressure squeezed the life out of her. Knowing that he had to act, and act quickly, Mark hauled himself to his feet. While healed, his body was terribly weak, and a screaming hunger had replaced the pain that had racked his flesh moments earlier. Biofuel, 1 of 30. He was almost completely out of juice, and he couldn't imagine how bad it would be if he ran out completely. But he didn't have a choice. Rushing toward Phoenix, who was still suspended nearly 20 feet off the ground, Mark gathered what strength he had left and leaped, flying through the air toward her. As his body approached the thick orb of mana, he could feel the danger it posed. Striking it would melt through his flesh in an instant. So, just before he reached it, he activated his null field. There was a ripple, and then the thick globe began unraveling as the mana rapidly fled. The closer Mark got, the faster it dissipated, and he reached her just as the last bit released its hold and she began to fall toward the ground. Grabbing her in his arms, Mark dropped back to the earth, landing with a heavy thud as he tried to cushion their fall. Phoenix was unresponsive, her head lolling back as he put her on the ground and checked her vitals. Her heart was still beating, but she wasn't breathing, which sent Mark into a panic. Canceling the null field, he grabbed for her belt, opening up the small emergency pack every ranger carried, and pulling one of the health potions out of it. Worried that it wouldn't be effective enough, Mark popped the cap off and, with a flick of his fingers, cut through his palm. Blood welled up, forming a thick crimson droplet, which he carefully dripped into the potion. Recorking it, he shook it even as the wound on his palm vanished. As his blood mixed with the potion, the color began to change, shifting to a brilliant red that carried a hint of black. Mark didn't have time to worry about what was happening to the potion, and once it was sufficiently shaken, he poured it down Phoenix's throat. Almost immediately, her body spasmed, and Mark quickly grabbed her neck, holding it stable as her body thrashed. He was just beginning to worry when she calmed down, and though she didn't wake up, her breathing restarted, color flooding back into her face. Glancing at her wrist again, Mark saw her vitals were back where they should be, yet she still didn't stir, no matter how he tried to wake her. Unsure what was going on, he gathered her up in his arms and quickly retreated. The fight in the cavern wasn't going well. The Bailiff was continuing to gain ground, sending out swarms of necroseeds to attack the leeches and the giant crab. Though they fared poorly against the lightning-clad leeches, they were beginning to win the fight against the crab, worming their way into its existing wounds, their vines piercing deep into its body. In the meantime, Langford, Kinsey, and Batten were doing their best to kill the nest, as it remained their primary target. Yet even though it was currently fighting battles with multiple people, they didn't seem to be able to do any real damage to it. As he tucked Phoenix out of the way behind some rocks, Mark looked around the battlefield, trying to figure out where he would be best suited to engage. Slowly, the ambient mana in the room was beginning to drop as it was used up without being replenished. Though it didn't seem as if it had done any good, in truth, Batten and Phoenix having shut off the flow of mana into the room was tremendously important, and Mark could only hope that the Rangers would be able to hang on long enough for the effects to truly come into play. Of course, the real threat was the Bailiff. He could see the vines creeping ever closer, and he was genuinely unsure how they were ever going to fight such a monster. Suddenly, a sharp pain struck him, and he doubled over with a gasp. Mark had been forcefully ignoring the hunger growing in him, but with every bit of biofuel he used up, it grew stronger and more insistent. And now, as his biofuel meter hit 0, it became impossible to ignore. As his mind began to blank, Mark's body shook, and his shadow rippled, creeping toward Phoenix, who lay unconscious beside him. He was out of sight behind one of the rocks, and no one noticed the change that was slowly coming over him. As thin fingers of shadow began to rise, reaching for Phoenix's exposed neck, Mark growled, a deep and guttural sound that caused his shadow to freeze in place. Crimson eyes slowly opened, glaring up at him. He met their gaze, a crazed look matching their intensity, and another low growl escaped from his lips. With a shudder, his shadow quickly retreated, and the eyes lost their ferocity, taking on a begging expression. Mark's body was trembling, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms, causing drops of blood to well up and slide down to the earth. Desperately, his eyes began to rove, searching for something, anything that he could consume. When he caught sight of a vine worming its way along the cavern wall, Mark sprang to his feet, and his shadow surged behind him. In a flash, Mark was sprinting as fast as he could, straight for the massive wall of vegetation fighting against the leeches. One of them, seeing Mark coming and recognizing the threat he posed, turned, unleashing a blast of lightning. But just before it struck, his body shifted, moving smoothly to the side as the lightning brushed past. A moment later, he hit the leech, his fingers sinking deep into its flesh, even as its teeth locked around his leg. With a growl, he tore its head apart, his fingers ripping through its body like a pair of scissors rapidly cutting snips of paper. He completely ignored the damage to his leg and the lightning burning him as he forcefully drove the leech back. Chunks of flesh that fell to the ground were rapidly gobbled up by his shadow, and Mark was past the dead monster, rushing toward the bailiff. 39. Lieutenant Langford was all the way across the room, fighting desperately against the nest when he caught sight of Mark just before he vanished into the sentient jungle of the bailiff's body. Swearing, the lieutenant stretched out his hands, lifting a discarded piece of pipe and using it to hammer down on the nest's body. The pipe was met with a blast of mana that blew it apart, transforming it into thousands of pieces of shrapnel. Without missing a beat, Langford took control of the pieces and transformed them into a whirling storm that he threw at the nest. Because it wasn't inherently mana-charged like his blades, the shrapnel couldn't be controlled by the nest, and he succeeded in carving out a chunk of its flesh. Enraged, the nest began firing blast after blast at him, forcing the lieutenant to flee as fast as he possibly could. Batten was in even worse shape, as every attempt he made to get close to the nest was met with a wave of force that sent him tumbling across the room. The best he could do was try to predict where the waves would come from and unleash heavy punches in that direction, hoping to break up the mana before it slammed into him. The only reason he was still on his feet was Kinsey's relentless healing, and she was on the last dregs of her power and running out of good options. Her healing abilities were tremendous, but even they couldn't stand up to hours of constant fighting, especially against Exlian of this rank. Desperately in need of rest, she finally staggered backward, her ability failing to activate as she came up dry. "I need a break," she gasped, and Langford gritted his teeth. "Retreat to the rocks," he said. "I'll cover Batten." As the two men rotated to try to join up, Kinsey half stumbled and half ran to the rocks where Phoenix's body was lying. Surprised to find her there, Kinsey dropped down next to Phoenix, gasping desperately as she unbuckled her helmet and grabbed a tube of nutrient paste to try to replenish some of her energy. Afraid that Phoenix might be hurt, she reached out to check her vitals and was surprised to see that Phoenix was practically bursting with vitality. So much so, it was almost concerning. Holding the tube of paste in her mouth, Kinsey started checking Phoenix over, trying to determine whether there were any hidden dangers. Thankfully, it seemed that Phoenix's body had forcefully induced a coma to prevent the surging vitality from adversely affecting her. What the effect would be, Kinsey didn't know, but it was clear that something astounding was happening to Phoenix's body. As the fight continued to rage, Mark was buried deep in the heart of a writhing jungle. With every step, he was attacked relentlessly from hundreds of angles. His flesh was pierced by thorns, his limbs bashed by heavy branches. Vines constantly tried to worm their way into his mouth, ears, and eyes, or crawl up his nose. But even as he was assaulted, Mark gave as good as he got. His shadow formed a writhing cloak, protecting his back even as it gobbled up everything it could touch. Tearing vines from his throat and swatting a piercing thorn from his ear, Mark pushed forward. His mind was in a strange daze, a shifting, cloudy state that made it impossible for him to think clearly. Had he been able to, he would have fled with all his might, trying desperately to get out of the death trap he had just thrown himself into. Instead, his body operated almost independently, as a single, overriding thought was fixed in his mind. Somewhere in the center of this jungle was something delicious he simply had to devour. So he pressed forward, his mind locked onto a silvery light that stood out in the psychic network. It seemed tantalizingly close, yet as he pushed forward, his speed began to slow. The deeper he went, the fiercer the Bailiff's attacks became. Though his body was riddled with wounds, they healed just as fast as they appeared. His consumption of biofuel was so rapid that the shadow trailing him could barely keep up, even though it was swallowing massive chunks of vegetation down as fast as possible. A thread of fear appeared in Mark's mind, cutting through the haze. Yet, before it could blossom and bring clarity, it was ruthlessly squashed. Mark, biting through a vine that tried to wrap itself around his head, surged forward, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Outside the jungle, Kinsey had just finished checking over Phoenix when she heard a faint hum and a beep that sent a thrill racing through her. Unable to believe her eyes, she double-checked her watch and then activated her comm, calling Langford and Batten. "The bombs! They're active! In 10 minutes, this whole place is going to blow!" Langford was so surprised he missed a block and was forced to rapidly retreat, pulling Batten with him to avoid